Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our in-house guests, we would ask that courtesy check that our various mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference. Leading our panel following our opening remarks will be Peter Brooks. Dr. Brooks is our Senior Fellow for National Security Affairs. Introducing our special guest today will be Luke Coffey, who serves as Director of our Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. Please join in welcoming him. Luke.
Thanks, John, and welcome everyone to the Heritage Foundation to talk about this important issue of the U.S.-Georgian bilateral relationship and the NATO-Georgia relationship. It's my pleasure to welcome back a friend of the Heritage Foundation, Ambassador David Badratze. Since December 2016, he's been the ambassador from Georgia to the United States. Prior to his appointment as ambassador to the U.S., he served as the State Minister of Georgia for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and at a very crucial time as well. He was responsible for the implementation of activities of the government of Georgia on all issues pertaining to Europe and Euro-Atlantic integration. And during this period, he worked on issues such as the EU-Georgia Association Agreement, Eastern Partnership issues for the European Union. Regarding NATO, worked on issues pertaining to the annual national program and the NATO-Georgia Commission, as well as coordinating strategic communication and European assistance programs for the government of Georgia. He has a very long and distinguished career in the diplomatic service going back to 2002, and he served in a number of very senior and official posts in the Georgian government and in public service going back to 1996. The ambassador graduated from Tbilisi State University with a degree in International Economic Relations and International Law, and he speaks Georgian, English, and Russian. So please join me in welcoming the ambassador here at Heritage Foundation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. First of all, let me start with thanking the Heritage Foundation and personally you for a very interesting, very comprehensive and I can say thought-provoking report on Georgia, on our aspirations, on our Euro-Atlantic path. I should say that it is very interesting document giving the very good overview of already present situation on the ground and provides very helpful suggestions to the government of Georgia, but also to our partners, to our strategic partners. And we highly value this support. The report rightly notes the Georgian government's achievements, which is in different fields, including reforms in defense and security sphere, the reforms directed to consolidating democracy, economic growth, and as we are in the Heritage Foundation, I should mention that Georgia in the Index of Economic Freedom for 2017 was number 13th in 180 countries, and it has made index's record for the most improved countries, and we are proud of that. Georgia has become a role model in the region in carrying out fundamental institutional reforms and in the democratic transformation. We launched a wave of the reforms in the spheres and areas that never have been tackled before. And we modernized our country to put it on an irreversible path of the Euro-Atlantic integration. Irreversible path to the freedom, democracy, and prosperity. And these are the values that we see our country belongs. Our society is very adamant, and we see European and Euro-Atlantic integration as an important provider of the guarantees for security, for prosperity of our country. Our relations with the alliance has been and is very solid and dynamic. According to the Warsaw Summit decision, Georgia has all practical tools necessary to advance to the NATO membership, and the government of Georgia is determined to realize our full potential to advance to the membership. We have very important tools. Look, you have mentioned several. Its annual national program, which already this year marks 10th anniversary of the annual national program, and Georgia has been presenting to its partners and allies our achievements on the democratic path. It is NATO-Georgia Commission, and annually around 20 plus meetings are held to provide political consultations on different matters between Georgia and the alliance. And this is a substantial NATO-Georgia package, which is a very important mechanism, very important tool to advance towards Georgia's defense capabilities building and interoperability with NATO. Within SNGP, it is important to note that we have started exercising of the NATO-Georgia exercises. This includes launching of the Joint Trained and Evaluation Center in Tbilisi, as well as Defense Institutions Building School, and all these provide a very good training opportunities for Georgian and partner servicemen and women. We continue to demonstrate our willingness and ability to contribute to the shared security. Through our participation in NATO military missions, we have proved that Georgia stands ready to share the burden of collective defense. Georgia is proud to be one of the leading countries in providing its troops in the Resolute Support Mission. Now we have 870 Georgian military serving in Afghanistan, and this is the commitment that will remain until the year of end of 2018, but also we will continue to support NATO's efforts in Afghanistan beyond that period. Besides, Georgia is a contributor to the NATO response force. Also, Georgia participates actively in the European Union Common Security and Defense Policy operations. And through its participation in EU and NATO missions, Georgia has proved, on the one hand, the political determination, but on the other hand, the capability to contribute to the common security and stability. We have demonstrated that we are not only looking for security guarantees, but we are also a strong contributor to the collective security. At the same time, on the bilateral level with the United States, we have strategic partnership that covers most important directions of our bilateral cooperation. One of them, I think it's really important to mention, is Georgia Defense Readiness Program that is being launched in Georgia, that provides very strong capabilities for Georgia in defense building, including the strengthening institutional mechanisms for manning, equipping, and sustaining units to ultimately result in a significant improvement of the Georgia defense forces and defensibility of the country. As you know, we have signed the agreement last year, which is on the purchase of the Javelin anti-armor missile systems, which have already arrived to Georgia. On the bilateral level, we enjoy a very strong political high-level cooperation. Last year was one more demonstration of that. We had high-level visits to the United States and to Georgia. Vice President Pence has visited Georgia last year in August, and once again reassured of the very strong support of Georgia's territorial integrity and sovereignty, as well as Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration. Coming back to the report, look, in this report, this report provides us with some very inspiring ideas and possible steps where we can see to be made by Georgia or by the United States and by our partners to achieve our ultimate goal, which is NATO membership. Some of the suggestions inscribed in the report are already being implemented by the Georgian government and our partners, but there are the other ones which we would wish to have more support from our friends. To name a few, and I know that there will be a very interesting panel discussion that will cover other parts of this report. To name a few, I want to first of all touch upon there was a call on the U.S. to reinforce support to Georgia's territorial conflict resolution. And I am happy to note that there have already been very big undertakings in this direction. Of course, stronger support will be highly appreciated, but in 2017 we have seen already very strong commitment on the bill level. We have seen the Appropriations Act that was signed by the President Trump, that included language supportive to Georgia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. This is a hallmark development, I can say, as the Congress fixed occupational language in its bill, and it calls, it first of all recognizes that Georgia's regions are occupied and calls on the government not to curb funding for those governments that recognize independence, so-called independence of the Georgia's occupied regions. And I think this act sends a very clear message of a U.S. Very strong and firm support to Georgia's territorial integrity, and we look forward to the year 2018 and more bills, more supportive languages to come up. Also, the report suggests that more NATO-Georgia cooperation in the Black Sea security framework. The current security environment in the Black Sea region calls for an increased information sharing and elaboration of the common approach. Therefore, the importance of the NATO-Georgia strategic discussion on the Black Sea security is really hard to overestimate. In this regard, at the Warsaw Summit, Georgia was included in and invited to participate in the dialogue on the Black Sea security, and we welcome the NATO's increased presence in the Black Sea and stand ready to actively participate in the practical efforts to enhance the Black Sea security on the ground. These are very briefly that I wanted to touch upon. I am really looking forward to participate and to listen to the participants of the panel discussion, and I'm open to answer some questions.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those remarks. We do have time for some questions. I ask that you have a pithy question, not a statement, and you please identify your name and your affiliation before you ask the question. So if there's any... Well, actually, I have a question I wanted to ask about... No, I have many questions, but what is the general mood in Georgia like with the public 10 years on from Bucharest, seeing progress on the NATO membership, but not quite getting there after each and every summit?
Thank you very much. Yes, this year we celebrate 10 years of the Bucharest summit that has stated that Georgia will become the member of NATO. This is the year of also Georgia's occupation of Georgia's regions. This is the year when annual national program was launched, when NATO-Georgia Commission was launched, and since then Georgia has really made an important steps forward to bring country closer to the NATO membership. I think the important detector of the public opinion is that throughout these years we have seen and witnessed maintained very strong support towards Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Very recent polls, as the polls in the previous years suggest, that more than 65% and more than 70% respectively to the NATO and EU membership Georgian public is favorable to. And this is also, I think, a result of a very active work by the government vis-à-vis strategic communication, vis-à-vis consolidating the support and demonstrating the importance of this reforms path that Georgia undertakes. This path that brings democracy, prosperity, and stability to the country, and that is indicated in our master plan, that is association agreement vis-à-vis our democratic transformation, that is indicated in the tangible results that we receive on Georgia's defensibility building, which was demonstrated in the substantial NATO-Georgia package, and also at the bilateral level, we receive a very strong support from our strategic partners like United States, and these tangible results on the EU or on the NATO side, for example, visa liberalization last year was one of the major achievements. This all brings a very strong belief in the public that all the reforms that Georgia undergo will eventually bring us to our ultimate goal. And I think this has a very strong support in the public.
Uh,
I'm happy to ask you a question. I didn't know if one of our guests had a question.
yes, Peter.
Thank you. Peter Brooks, the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for those comments. I've read some reports recently about the Russians proposing joint military forces with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and also about further encroachment on Georgian territory by moving barbed wire and markers and things along that line. In fact, I saw something that said they may have encroached another 2,300 feet into Georgia, and I wonder if you could update us on those reports if they are in fact accurate.
Yes, thank you very much. Since the occupation of Georgia's region in 2008, Russia has been continuing its activities to disrupt the situation on the ground, to throughout the actions that you have mentioned, be it the razor wire fences alongside the occupation line, closing the checkpoints alongside the occupation line, or the agreements so-called agreements that you have mentioned with Tskhinvali or Sukhumi, de facto leadership to sign the so-called agreements on cooperation, on integration with one, and on partnership with other, that includes the incorporation of the local institutions into the federal one that we call a creeping annexation. And this unfortunately continues against the backdrop of very grave humanitarian situation on the ground. We see that Georgian language population and children are deprived of their fundamental right to study in their own language. Closing of the checkpoints doesn't give them opportunity to cross the occupation line and get their education. So on the other hand, what we see from the Georgian side is the steps to reconcile with the public, to show that on the one hand we have took pledge of non-use of force at the presidential level, at the parliamentary level, but also we have had steps to build the trust between the public. By the way, United States is a very strong supporter of that actions on the ground alongside the occupation line for the people living adjacent to the occupation line. But of course, also all the benefits of the Georgian citizens are shared with our citizens residing in the occupied regions, be it free healthcare, be it visa-free travel with Georgian passports, be it also I can mention, and I should mention, the US-supported hepatitis C elimination program, etc., to somehow help the public to build the trust among each other, and something that through the measures that Russia takes on the ground is really, we see it as a very strong obstacles to that process.
Any last questions? Yeah, of course.
I'm the same person. Second question.
think
Third
I was looking
question. I understand that Secretary of Defense Mattis met with your defense minister at the Munich Security Conference. Can you give us some updates on what they discussed and what was important from the Georgian perspective?
Georgia and the United States have a strategic partnership charter in which security and defense cooperation is one of the major components. 2 years ago, Georgia and the United States have signed the Defense and Security Cooperation Memorandum, under which we are in the process of launching Georgia Defense Readiness Program, which will help Georgia build its defense ability to have a more advanced and capable structure of defense system. Last year, the Minister of Defense have visited the United States, had a bilateral meeting with Secretary Mattis, with National Security Advisor McMaster, and last year also has demonstrated a very strong support to Georgia in the defense and security sphere. We have signed the agreement on purchasing of the Javelin anti-tank missile system, which is very important, and it's already stored in Georgia. Important development of our bilateral trust and cooperation and reliability of our relations. This year at the Munich conference, we had one more meeting, this time with the Prime Minister of Georgia, have met with the Secretary Mattis, with Foreign Minister and Defense Minister also participated in this discussion. We believe that we see our United States as our main strategic partner. This is not only due to our bilateral agreement, but also Georgia's parliament, as an institution that defines Georgian foreign policy goals, has described the United States as our main strategic partner, and this includes, understandably, from Georgia's perspective, as in the region with security challenges, understands the importance of the defense cooperation with the United States that we pursue on our work as an embassy, but as well as on bilateral level between the governments.
Oh, one more very quick one. One more, the lady here.
Hi, I'm Nana Sajaya from the Voice of America Georgian Service. Mr. Ambassador, the report published by Luke Koff has been widely discussed in Georgia recently, especially after his visit. And the main topic there is, as you well know, the amendment to the Article number 6 in NATO Charter. With upcoming Brussels summit, is Georgian government willing to make effort to push this issue into agenda?
I have to mention, first of all, that NATO and its partners throughout these years have been very strong and vocal supporters of Georgia's territorial integrity. When in 2008 decision was made that Georgia will become the member of NATO, when in 2011 Georgia has become the aspirant country, or 2014 when we have been granted the substantial NATO-Georgia package, all this time these challenges were there of Georgia's territorial integrity, and nevertheless NATO and its allies are helping Georgia to advance on its NATO partnership. Therefore, any speculation that has been in Georgian public vis-a-vis this issue has absolutely no ground, that the Georgia's territorial integrity has never been and will never be a precondition. Georgian government, every policy is directed to Georgia's territorial integrity and its sovereignty. When it comes to the when it comes to the Warsaw Summit, Georgia will seek to see the progress it has achieved to be addressed at the summit level, at the political and practical level. As we have mentioned a couple of times today, this year marks 10 years of the Bucharest Summit, and we see that once again reassurance and reaffirmation of the fact that Georgia will become the NATO member on the NATO side will be important, as well as to see some practical possibilities to advance on the security, which is Black Sea security, and Georgia has presented its vision on Georgia's contribution to the Black Sea security, and I think this will be a very important and tangible deliverables of the summit in Brussels.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll just quickly add to that, since it was my report that was mentioned, that Georgia should never be asked by NATO to decide between its territorial integrity or membership, and that should never be the case. And one of the things that attracted me and many others to Georgia and the people's drive and commitment, optimism about its role in the region and in the world, and has a very proud history. And if I was Georgian, I would say it wouldn't be worth the cost giving up on your territorial integrity to join NATO, because Georgia's been around way before NATO existed, and it'll be around way after NATO is here. And that should never be the question, and it wasn't what I proposed in my paper either. But thank you. Join me in thanking the ambassador. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Ambassador for his words and remarks this afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Let's move on to the panel discussion. As you know, 2018 marks two significant anniversaries for Georgia. Not only 10 years since Russia aggressively invaded Georgian territory, but also a decade since NATO promised Georgia eventual alliance membership at the Bucharest summit. Today, Russia continues to occupy 20% of Georgian territory, and Georgia still prominently supports NATO despite its lack of membership. The good news is that so far the Trump administration has proved to be a staunch supporter of Georgia. Vice President Pence, which was mentioned earlier, visited Georgia last August, and the State Department and the U.S. Congress approved a significant Javelin anti-tank missile sale to Georgia last December. But there are still questions to be answered. For instance, in what ways can the administration further display its support for Georgia? Will President Trump advocate for Georgia to become a part of NATO? Joining us today to discuss these questions and others are three distinguished panelists whose impressive bios I'll abbreviate for the sake of time. I apologize. First, Luke Coffey is the director of of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies here at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, Luke served in the Heritage's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, where he focused on transatlantic and Eurasian security issues. Before joining Heritage, Luke served in the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense as a senior special advisor to then Secretary of State for Defense, Liam Fox. He's also a decorated U.S. Army veteran. We also have today Dr. Mamuka Tsereteli, who is a senior fellow with the Central Asia Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program based in Washington, D.C. He previously served as the director of the Center for Black Sea Caspian Studies at American University. Dr. Tsereteli has also served as the founding executive director of the America-Georgia Business Council and as economic counselor at the Embassy of Georgia in Washington. Finally, Ambassador William Courtney is a former U.S. ambassador to Georgia and currently serves as an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and executive director of the RAND Business Leaders Forum. Earlier, he served as special assistant to the president and senior director of the National Security Council staff for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, ambassador to Kazakhstan, and deputy U.S. negotiator in U.S.-Soviet defense and space talks in Geneva. That's quite a panel. I look forward to hearing what all of you have to say on today's topic. Luke, can you start us off with some comments? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. And again, thanks everyone for coming today. As it was already pointed out, 2018 is a very important year in the U.S.-Georgia, NATO-Georgia relationship. I would like to discuss why Georgian membership into NATO is important for the United States, talk a little bit about what Russia's doing now in the region, and then talk about, practically speaking, what can be done to improve the relationship on a bilateral level, but also inside the alliance as well. I think there are three main reasons why it is in America's interest that Georgia becomes a member of NATO. The first one is we should be rewarding dependable allies. Georgia has proven itself over the years to be a dependable and credible ally to the United States. At the height of the war in Afghanistan, when some European countries were withdrawing, Georgia had 2,000 troops in southern Afghanistan in some of the most deadliest parts of the country in Helmand Province and Kandahar. At the time of the Russian invasion in 2008, Georgia had the second largest troop contribution after the United States and Iraq. It's also contributed to Balkan security operations, missions in Africa through the CSDP, as was mentioned by the ambassador. And it's made a commitment on initiatives like the NATO Response Force. It spends over 2% of GDP on defense. And the Georgian people have shown, carried a heavy burden in places like Afghanistan, where on a per capita basis, they've suffered the most killed in action, even though they only joined the campaign about halfway through in around 2009, 2010. So they're dependable, and America needs dependable allies. The second is some of the more normative issues and values-based issues that are in America's interest to see in this region of the world. Since the end of the Soviet Union, Georgian progress has been nothing short of a miracle, really, considering the difficulty it has in the broader region. And it's made great improvements on governance, on economic performance, on security engagement, on their legal system. And does it have more work to do? Yes. Do we have more work to do in the United States? Yes. Does Britain? Yes. Germany? Yes. Democracy is a process and not an event. Sometimes it's a generational change. It requires a generation. Sometimes it even takes longer. But the important thing is Georgia's heading in the right direction and has made huge improvements since the early days of the early 1990s. And again, the U.S. should be rewarding this. Finally, the third reason is more of a selfish one for the United States, and this is the geostrategic reason. Georgia is sat in a very difficult part of the world, but also a very important part of the world when it comes to transit of energy, oil and gas, rail, various other commerce that can travel from east to west, from the heart of Central Asia to Europe. It can play a vital role in terms of resupplying U.S. forces in Afghanistan, for example, because of its region, because of its location. And there's a lot of value to this, and it's very important for the United States. We shouldn't lie about it. So it's important that the U.S. has a strong, dependable ally in the South Caucasus for these reasons. Now, regarding the current state of the relationship, I would say it's very healthy. I was like many who during the presidential campaign was alarmed by some of the things I was hearing from then candidate Trump about NATO and Europe. But President Trump, with the sale of Javelin to Georgia, did something in 8 months what President Obama refused to do in 8 years. Vice President Pence went to Tbilisi very early, recognized the Russian presence there as an occupation immediately. And, we've seen this bilateral relationship thrive under the Trump administration. And I think it's heading in the right direction. I think this is very good. What's complicating these matters, of course, is what Russia's doing in the region, especially in Georgia with its so-called hybrid warfare information operations. A great example is with my report, the recommendation I made about Georgia joining NATO, all of Georgia's internationally recognized territory joining NATO, but the two occupied regions not getting the Article 5 protection until the conflict is resolved peacefully, was spun in the Russian influence and Russian-based media to mean that NATO's asking you to either choose between your territorial integrity or NATO. And if you read the report, it's not what it says at all, but I could see how Russia could cause problems with this. And then you have what was already mentioned by the question from my colleague Peter about the creeping annexation of Georgia. I was in Georgia about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, and I was driving on the East 60 highway between Tbilisi and going to Bajormi. And from the highway, you can see a green sign about 400 yards from the highway that says, it's a so-called state border sign that was put there by Russia and Russian-backed separatists trying to mark out a border. And we've seen cases of fencing going up, signs being posted, surveillance cameras, barbed wire fences, cases of people going to bed in free Georgia and waking up in occupied Georgia, farms being divided, families being divided. And there's a huge personal cost to this. And the Heritage Foundation, in our research, and I highlight this in my report, found 56 cases of borderization in 48 different locations since 2011. So this is a real challenge. So I'll sum up by talking about some of the practical steps that we can do. I lump these into two categories, political and then more practical and military. The political steps I think we should do is keep up the political presence in Georgia. It was great that Vice President Pence visited early on. We need to continue the drumbeat of high-level U.S. visitors from the cabinet. There are other issues pertaining to the U.S.-Georgian relationship other than defense, so there's a lot of scope for other members of the cabinet to visit Georgia. I would like, at the NATO summit in Brussels, I would like to see the NATO-Georgia Commission meet at the heads of government level. I think this would send a very important signal 10 years after Bucharest that the alliance is still committed to eventual membership. Most of the time, well, every time at the summit, if this commission does meet, it does so at the foreign ministerial level. So I think it'd be great to see it meet at the heads of state or heads of government level. I would like to see initiative from the U.S. for a free trade agreement. Georgia has a free trade agreement with China, with the EU, with every former state of the Soviet Union, with soon, I think this year, with India, later this year or soon. If Georgia's good enough for China and India, why isn't it good enough for the United States? And when you speak to some people from USTR, they say, well, the market's small, the juice isn't worth the squeeze on the negotiations, and it's not about economic benefit to the U.S., it's about sending a geopolitical message to Georgia and to the region. And I would like to see more U.S. political support for regional transit initiatives like the Southern Gas Corridor, in the same way we saw during the Clinton administration in the 90s give high-level political support for BTC. I think doing so for Southern Gas Corridor would help initiatives like this in the future. And I think the U.S. should do what it can to pressure our European allies who don't already recognize the presence of almost 10,000 Russian troops inside Georgia's internationally recognized territory as an occupation to start doing so. There are some U.S. allies, including the UK, for example, who don't recognize the presence of Russian troops in Georgia as an occupation. And I think this wishy-washy approach sends all the wrong signals, especially after what we've seen in Ukraine. In terms of the practical steps and more military focused, in my report I offer the suggestion of the U.S. inviting Georgia to contribute to the enhanced forward presence U.S.-led battalion in Poland. Georgia is always looking for new ways to contribute to transatlantic security, and this would be a great way not only to improve the relationship with NATO, but also deepen that relationship, that bilateral relationship with the United States. The U.S. we've done a great thing providing anti-tank weapons to Georgia. We should now start looking at anti-aircraft and air defense weapons to Georgia. These are defensive weapons, so as long as you don't plan on violating Georgia's airspace, you shouldn't fear such weapons. The Black Sea's already been mentioned. We need to do more in the Black Sea in the U.S. The Black Sea is very important strategically for the United States for in my opinion, for one of the main reasons that's never discussed, and that is the countries of the Black Sea, be it NATO or NATO aspirant or NATO hopeful countries. So Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey as the NATO countries, and Ukraine and Georgia as the non-NATO countries, but NATO partner countries, account for 1/5 of all European troops currently in Afghanistan. Just these 5 countries. So it's in America's interest, again, to reward and work with our partners in the region. And that's why I recommend NATO opening up a center of excellence for Black Sea security somewhere in Georgia, maybe Batumi or something like this along the Black Sea, because there are a lot of challenges associated with operating in the Black Sea. And it would be good to have a center where all the allies can work together to try to come up with better practices and doctrine, for example. And then finally, the issue that has been discussed already, this idea of amending Article 6 of the North Atlantic Treaty to get Georgia into NATO faster. Article 6 is the bit of the treaty that defines where NATO's Article 5 protection applies. It's been amended in the past. It was amended when Greece and Turkey joined. It's been amended since Algeria became independent because French Algeria used to fall under NATO's Article 5. And so my proposal is that Georgia is invited to join NATO. All of Georgia's internationally recognized territories invited to join, but the two occupied regions do not get NATO's Article 5 protection until the conflict is resolved peacefully. And this is in line with the Georgian government's non-use of force pledge. This is how it differs from the situation in Ukraine, for example. So if you have a non-use of force pledge committing to not using your military to retake these territories, then you don't need an Article 5 security guarantee on these territories. And in the future, when the conflict is resolved and Georgia's full territorial integrity is brought back under Tbilisi's control, then we can amend the Article 6 again to include it. But until that time, I think it's an unnecessary roadblock to Georgia's NATO membership, because when I visit capitals in Europe or even some policymakers here in Washington, their immediate concern about Georgian membership is that this would mean an automatic war with Russia because of the occupation. And my proposal takes this completely off the table. But I do see how it can be spun in nefarious ways by certain actors. So I'll conclude there, and we can elaborate on some more of these issues during the question and answer part of the panel.
Thank you, Luke. Ambassador?
Thank you, Peter. Let me first say that Luke's paper is an excellent paper, and I hope all of you have had a chance to read through it. Russia is turning away from post-Cold War security structures, and it has invaded Georgia and Ukraine. In this context, the admission into NATO of the Central European and Baltic states has turned out to have been foresighted. It has enhanced the security of Central and Eastern Europe and of all of Europe. But does this logic hold for Georgia? Would NATO membership increase security for Georgia and for Europe? Or might an attempt to bring Georgia into NATO tempt Moscow to reanimate the Brezhnev Doctrine? These are large questions. Fortunately, for now, we do not need the answers to those questions. Georgia is not ready to join NATO, and European allies will not support NATO membership for Georgia anytime soon. Instead, Georgia and its friends should focus on getting Georgia ready to join when the opportunity arises. Georgia must be seen as a net security contributor to NATO, and it must grow its economy, improve its democracy, and continue pragmatic cooperation with neighbors, including Russia. Georgia has made substantial progress, but more will be required for European allies to view Georgia as ready for membership. Is Georgia a net security contributor? To a considerable extent, yes. Georgia, as Luke has pointed out, makes the highest per capita contribution of any country to NATO's mission in Afghanistan. Georgia is among the top 5 NATO members in numbers of troops there and in defense spending as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product. On the other hand, Georgia's geography is challenging. An effective defense of Georgia would require forward NATO presence, stronger territorial defenses, support from Turkey, and credible NATO reinforcement capacity. Turning to Georgia's economy, over the past decade, it has grown by an average of 5% per year. If reforms are sustained, medium-term growth might be, on average, a healthy 4.5% per year. But Georgia must grow faster. In current U.S. dollars in 2016, Georgia's GDP per capita was only $3,866, according to World Bank data. For the Baltics, the only post-Soviets now in NATO, per capita GDP was 4 times higher. European allies must be confident that Georgia can bear the financial cost of membership. Democratic development is a strong point for Georgia. Civil society is vibrant, the press and media are generally free, and there is space for discourse and independent organizations. Democratic elections are ingrained, and transitions of power are peaceful. On Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index for 2017, Georgia ranks 46th from the top, which is the best, versus 85th in 2002. This is a tremendous improvement. Yet there are weaknesses in the rule of law in Georgia and in the habits of charismatic or wealthy leaders who rule in ways that are sometimes non-democratic or non-transparent. Georgia is pursuing pragmatic cooperation with neighbors. With Russia, many trade, tourism, and communication ties have been restored. Georgian wine is again flowing northward. In 2017, more than 1 million Russian tourists visited Georgia. There is a dialogue to help protect Georgian workers in Russia. At every NATO summit, Georgia should seek reaffirmation of the Bucharest commitment to membership. But Tbilisi should not make achievement of a membership action plan the measure of success. Instead, Tbilisi should seek increased practical cooperation with the alliance and its members, as Luke has emphasized. This will help Georgia bolster territorial defenses, making it a more resilient and harder target. Multilateral exercises in Georgia build capacity and show commitment. NATO and its members should build on their superb training and equipping efforts. Georgia will benefit from additional sophisticated capacity, including lethal weaponry, to deter and defend. This will help it raise the cost to any potential aggressor and help it make itself ready for NATO membership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Now, I will have slightly different perspective on issues from Ambassador Courtney, I guess. But I'll start with the point why actually Luke elaborated about why the United States needs to look at NATO's membership Georgia's membership into NATO. But I would like to stress one important point why Georgia needs to be a part of NATO. Obvious answer to that question is obviously security of Georgia. But there are other elements there that are important because security brings stability and predictability of life in Georgia, including economic life necessary for future advancement of the country and prosperity and well-being of the citizens. And NATO membership actually will accelerate Georgia's integration into more advanced political, technological, educational, cultural space than offered by alternative Eurasian Economic Union. So it is a priority for Georgia to have security in order to achieve all the other goals that country has for its development going forward. President Shevardnadze first declared Georgia's aspiration to NATO membership at NATO summit in Prague on November 21 in 2002. And since that, all the administrations of Georgia pursued this goal, which shows that there is a determination in Georgia to become member of NATO. So there's a consensus among different political groups, dominant political groups in the country. In terms of the strategy for membership, pushing for the membership action plan should no longer be the priority for Georgia. I'm arguing this for several years now. In terms of the military compatibility and political military reforms, Georgia is already very close to NATO standards. And In addition, current instruments of bilateral relations, as the ambassador mentioned earlier, provide those instruments and mechanisms for Georgia to become member. The priority is to convince the NATO partners that short of granting membership, Georgia expects an announcement at the Brussels summit. I was arguing this before the Warsaw summit as well, that current political and military components of Georgia-NATO partnership can lead to membership without membership action plan. This decision will allow the alliance to grant Georgia membership when the political moment is right. And we know what is the obstacle to political moment. I disagree with Ambassador Courtney in terms of Georgia's readiness to the NATO membership, because NATO accepted countries that we are less ready for NATO membership than Georgia is today. I will not mention countries right now. Russia is the main obstacle to Georgia's NATO membership. We all agree probably with this point. And that's what prevents Georgia from becoming a member of the NATO. There's no secret that concessions doesn't allow us to achieve much in relationships with Russia. For years, Washington and many of its allies in Europe were keen to avoid anything that could escalate tensions with Russia. Looking at developments in Ukraine, that cautious approach didn't really produce desirable results. Unfortunately, President Obama's declaration in March 2014 that neither Ukraine or Georgia are currently on a path to NATO membership was understood by Moscow as Russia's veto power over enlargement of alliance. That led to much greater escalation of the conflict in Eastern Europe, as we all know. Russia is a threat to stability in Eastern Europe and Black Sea region, but Russia is also still the rational power, rational actor. The only issue is that current Russian leadership only understands the language of power politics. Russia no longer feels bound with Helsinki commitments, which was, by the way, signed by Soviet Union, and CFE treaty obligations, conventional forces in Europe obligations, because Russia knows that it could get away with these decisions, with this type of decisions. It is in the interest of global stability to bring Russia back into a system of international norms and rules, but it will not happen with concessions, unfortunately. Russia would understand strong messages, and the US and NATO should probably declare a temporary hold on the commitments to the CFE treaty obligations and 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act limitations on the size of troop deployments and equipment in Central and Eastern Europe, and deploy military assets in Eastern Europe and Black Sea to match Russia in terms of size of forces and type of equipment. These forces and equipment should remain in the area until Russia removes its military equipment and personnel from conflict areas and occupational areas from Georgia, Ukraine. Georgia, as well as Ukraine and Moldova, need assistance in strengthening their defense capabilities that should make aggression against these countries much costlier, and I think we all agree with that, and steps were made to that direction already, positive steps with the sale of some equipment to Georgia and Ukraine. NATO needs to continue political dialogue with Russia from the position of strength and delivers once again message that NATO is not a threat to Russia. I mean, this is, I understand what is the value of that conversation, but I think it's essential that this conversation is going forward. I think Russia's security will benefit, and I'm sure some strategists in Moscow understand that, with NATO's presence in some of the areas that Russia has interest, like it was the case in Afghanistan. Russia's NATO and the United States military presence in Afghanistan actually served as a sort of public good for Russia's security interests in that part of the world. Thus, instead of targeting Georgia and manipulating with its security environment, Russia could benefit from adjusting its political policies and accepting Georgia's NATO membership from the perspective that this will strengthen southern borders of Russia and provide greater security for its interests in North Caucasus. I'm strong believer that sooner or later Russia will understand that NATO provides, because Russia and European Union and NATO and United States and other allies face some of the same challenges. NATO in many ways serves the common goals and objectives that Russia and others share. If Russia changes its position and it's, the issue of the conflict areas in Abkhazia and South Ossetia can be, the problems in those areas and conflicts could be resolved in direct negotiations between Abkhazians and Georgians and Ossetians and Georgians, where the international community can serve as the greatest guarantor of agreements between the parties within the framework of the internationally recognized borders of Georgia. One additional element just wanted to add to my prepared remarks is that we sometimes forget about how, since we are discussing Bucharest summit and 10 years anniversary from that date, that mistake was made in Bucharest by committing to Georgia's and Ukraine's membership to NATO, but not delivering on that and not providing mechanisms of that membership at that time. And this is happening after 2 months when, after recognition of independence of Kosovo, President Putin publicly several times, as well as other Russian officials, made clear that there will be response to that decision of Western countries to recognize independence of Kosovo. So he threatened Georgia directly. And NATO and others knew about that threat. So steps were made to somehow address this threat, but not enough and not adequate. And that resulted in military actions and occupation of Georgian territories. So I think that element of this history 10 years ago should be somehow part of our conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move to question and answer. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll bring around a microphone if you would be courteous enough to identify yourself and to whom the question is addressed. I don't know where our folks are right now. So can everybody, can you hear him?
Can you speak up?
Yeah, could you speak up a little bit? I don't know where our folks are with the microphones. I apologize.
I think he's
coming
in now.
Okay.
So the question actually is for all of you. The notion, the idea of applicability of the PIC is not new, but the report, the first one, that suggests that discourse in a formal sense of person. So that notion was suggested initiated from the very beginning of the war.
Was initiated from the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia and started in the backstages, and the experts were talking about that a lot. But none of the governments, not the current one or the previous one, has never communicated that message to the public of Georgia itself with its citizens. But my question is, what gives you the hope? Because as Georgian, I know that there is that conspiracy theory is really strong among Georgians. They believe that that scenario would eventually lead to that Georgia will abandon its occupied territories. And that message has never been communicated with the citizens. So what gives you a hope that the current government would start communicating with its own citizens on that matter? Because this Georgia's integration into NATO is not one-side game. Georgia should also put a lot of effort, if it's clear. Thanks.
Who'd like to take that one?
I guess I had better since
it's your fault.
Yeah. Right. One of the reasons why I wrote this paper and I tried to come up with some unique and creative recommendations is because I've been following this issue for a decade now. And I'm tired of hearing the same thing, frankly. And I wanted to inject some new thought and some new debate into this issue. And in that sense, I've definitely succeeded. I think that if the Georgian government firstly, I'll say that you're right. This proposal is nothing new for Georgia watchers. And I've heard privately and off the record from Georgian officials, some senior, some junior, over the years, transcending different governments, the idea of this proposal, right? And I think we're going to get to a point where if the Georgian government, whichever government that might be today or into the future, leads on this issue and has a proper strategic communications campaign with the public on this issue to explain what my proposal or what this proposal is and what it's not, I think many Georgians would think, yeah, actually, this is a very sensible idea. Again, I want to reiterate, this isn't asking Georgia to give up on its territorial integrity. It's requesting, it's acknowledging that all of Georgia joins, including Shkin Valley region and Abkhazia, but only the non-occupied regions get Article 5. And, there's precedent for this. A few months back when North Korea was threatening Guam, I was reading a lot in the Europeans were freaking out, like, oh my God, Guam, we're going to go to war, Article 5, NATO, because of Guam. But no, that's not true. I mean, Article 6 of the North Atlantic Treaty says that NATO's area of responsibility is the North Atlantic region north of the Tropic of Cancer. And that treaty, or that amendment has been, article has been amended in the past to deal with the current security situation at any given time. And there's no reason why it can't be amended in the future. And like I said, the reason why this would work for Georgia and not Ukraine is because Georgia has a non-use of force pledge. So because of the non-use of force pledge, it doesn't need an Article 5 security guarantee for the occupied regions. So I'm optimistic if, people want to be led, and if someone wants to lead on this issue, I think we could, make progress on it.
Anyone else would like to say something?
Main question is, I think, with or without that amendment or that approach, what the NATO and European allies, as Bill mentioned, if alliance is ready for even consider Georgia's membership. And I think answer is no at this stage, unfortunately. So why even going into this tension sort of discussion? Although I agree that education about details of way NATO membership works and where the coverage of Article 5 stretches and so forth is important element. And Georgian public needs to know more about all those details if Georgia is going into path and education in terms of details of membership, what it brings to Georgia. I think it's essential part of the that government policy should pursue.
Marina McGrail, I can project as well. Marina McGrail, I'm a transitioning naval officer. I have a question for kind of both Luke and Ambassador Courtney as well. So you both mentioned, Luke, I know you mentioned the Southern Gas Corridor in Georgia, and Ambassador Courtney, you had mentioned the underdeveloped oil fields and also the increase, I guess, 5% growth per year in the Georgian economy. What is, given those two statistics, what is Georgia currently doing to, I guess, take advantage of its natural resources and in order to both boost the economy, but also kind of offset the influence that Russian companies such as Gazprom and Rosneft have over the Georgian economy?
Well, Georgia is predominantly plays its role as a transit country, bringing oil and gas from the Caspian region and Central Asia to European markets. And I think this is one of the reasons why stability in Georgia is seen as a threat to Russia, because they know that every barrel of oil or cubic square foot of gas that gets to Europe via Georgia and Azerbaijan is one less that gets to Europe through Russia. And it helps Europeans diversify their energy sources, and it makes Europeans ultimately safer as well. The first The first pipeline carried kerosene in I think it was in the 1850s. The first oil one was, I think, in early 1900s, like 1903 or 4 or something like that. And today, these single old pipelines have transformed into this vast network, bringing these resources. So Georgia plays an important role in the transit of these resources to Europe. But also, it was announced recently, or relatively recently, that Georgia's now buying its gas from Azerbaijan instead of also from Russia. So I think this was a shrewd move by Tbilisi to not allow Russia to use energy as a weapon.
That's the case since 2009. So
Yeah.
Georgia no longer uses any, and last year actually didn't use any gas at all from Russia.
Ambassador, do you have some thoughts?
Just a couple thoughts. It's good for Georgia to have multiple sources of gas supply. So the goal ought not to be no gas from Russia. The goal ought to be to maximize Georgia's leverage with all potential suppliers of gas. With regard to Georgia's own gas reserves, a U.S. company has been exploring for gas in Georgia for many years now, but there are issues of the investment climate in Georgia that have posed obstacles. Georgia needs to focus on improving its investment climate in the energy sector.
Why don't we go right here? And I see a question over there, and I think there's one over here too. So we've got a couple more questions.
Hi, I'm Leanne Poirier. I'm a graduate student at GW. I had a question for Luke on your suggestion of the amending of Article 6 of the North Atlantic Treaty. What makes you think that there would be a peaceful resolution to the territorial issues? And then what responsibilities would fall on the international community if it ends up in a stalemate, that there's no peaceful resolution and the situation stays the same?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm proposing this idea is because I don't see in any feasible scenario in the near future where this will be resolved peacefully. But that doesn't mean that someday it won't be. And I think it's an unnecessary roadblock to Georgia joining NATO, again, because of the non-use of force pledge. When I speak to, as I mentioned, when I speak to different officials at different capitals and also here in Washington, they say that Georgia can't join because of the occupation. But Georgia has a non-use of force pledge to use military force about the occupation. So, maybe we should have a discussion about the terms in which Georgia could join NATO. And, it's a lot more than just the occupied territories. I mean, there are other issues, Georgia's overcoming to address some concerns from European countries about joining, and these have to be dealt with as well. And some of them were mentioned on this panel. But we need to, I really believe that we need to, take this issue off the table about the occupation in terms of Georgia's NATO membership. And, hopefully someday Georgia's full territorial integrity will be restored under the control of Tbilisi. But honestly, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we have to, continue on.
What has Russia said officially about Georgia joining NATO? I mean, I don't think anybody's mentioned that. I mean, it's kind of a question here that.
Well, I mean, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, Peter, because one of the reasons why I think, my proposal can be useful is because Russia thinks all it has to do is invade and partially occupy a country, and then it stops it from integrating with Europe or NATO. And if you remove that tool that they have in their toolbox from them, then it creates, I think it would bring Russia to a faster realization that it needs to find a better way to work with its neighbors, to work with Europe, to work with NATO. Without a doubt, I think it's known that Russia doesn't want Georgia to join NATO or the European Union. Same with Ukraine. I think that's obvious by their actions. I mean, a few months after Bucharest, Georgia's invaded. Talk of association agreement between Ukraine and the EU in November 2013 led to the invasion and annexation of Crimea in February of 2014. So I think there's definitely a link to this. But if you remove that from the debate, then I think it weakens their hand and strengthens ours. I understand there are good arguments, to both sides of this. My idea, or my job working at a think tank, is to think and get ideas out there so we can have discussions like this.
Ambassador, you have some thoughts?
One important comment came just weeks after the Russian invasion in 2008. Then President Medvedev said that Russia reserved the right to have, quote, privileged interests, end quote, in other countries, what in the West we call a sphere of influence. So that makes fairly clear, I think, what Russia's intention would be to block or seek to block Georgia's admission to NATO.
Have we had anything since then? Do we have anything since, that's 2008, that's a decade ago. So we had anything official since then? I mean, we sense things, but I'm just putting it out for the record.
Most important action after that was Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, so the actions, but no official statements that we...
I won't say there are no official statements.
That you're aware of, is that what you're saying?
But the actions have been the most important thing.
Okay.
Every foreign policy strategy that Russian government crafted since 1999 or 2000 has the point that that Russia considers borders of former Soviet Union as the strategic borders of Russia, and is against foreign military presence in that perimeter of borders. And this is something that not only official Russia tries to communicate, but also ideologues like extremes and non-extreme ideologues, all of the kind of consensus in Russian sort of public opinion that no foreign troops should be present in the, obviously Baltics are out of this reach now, but rest of the Russia, former Soviet Union territory. So there are official documents that say that.
Back here, I think we had time for two more questions, probably.
Thank you. My name is David Nikuradze. I represent Georgian television station Rustavito in Washington, D.C. It was always extremely difficult for the United States administration to communicate with European colleagues about NATO enlargement. We remember it's a NATO summit in Bucharest. Germany and France said no to membership action plan. Even we've seen some good signs from the current administration. Do you still believe that Donald Trump, President Trump, will be ready to start dialogue with Chancellor Merkel and French leaders about this issue, about NATO enlargement? Thank you very much.
Is that to the panel in general or one particular person? Anybody want to field that question?
Well, in regards to enlargement in general, imagine 18 months ago having a conversation that went something like this. President Trump will sign the accession protocol for Montenegro to join NATO on the same day that his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, arrives in Moscow for his first visit. It would have been unthinkable, right? No one would have believed it, but it happened. And it looks like we're making some headway on the name dispute, the ridiculous name dispute between Macedonia and Greece, and hopefully issues can be resolved by the summit to where Macedonia can join the alliance. And if I was the Georgian government, I would do everything I could to make Macedonia's success Georgia's success, to use that as an example to show the Georgian people that, look, the door is still open. But we'll see what happens.
Now, where do I have questions left? We have one here and one here. Okay, so go ahead, sir. And then I'll get you.
Thank you. I'm Alad Vaid. I'm with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So my question is specifically for Mr. Coffey. Assuming that Georgia does join NATO under the conditions you mentioned, and that we keep supplying them with defensive weapons and systems, what do you think the long-term U.S. and NATO strategy should be? Do you see any conditions under which Russia would eventually withdraw from its occupation? Thank you.
It's difficult to say because there'd be so many different variables and hypotheticals in this scenario. But one thing it would probably do is it would send a message to Russia that invading and partially occupying a country no longer prevents that country from fulfilling its own destiny. It would stop further invasion of Georgia because it would be severe consequences. And I think it would also focus the region more. I think, Turkey, for example, for decades has been a very important member of NATO, especially because of its location during the Cold War and the size of its army. And, getting NATO more involved in the Black Sea and the South Caucasus could maybe be a way to sort of energize that role of Turkey inside the alliance. People say, wouldn't this be antagonistic to Russia? Well, hell, Russia's already invaded and occupied 20% of Georgia. So I don't know. Would membership be antagonistic to Russia? Maybe, but they're already antagonized. And we have to deal with the world we're in and not in the world we want to be in. So I would say that it's difficult to, I don't know how Russia would react or if it would force them to leave the occupied regions. I doubt it, at least in the short term. They seem pretty entrenched there, but you never know.
Yes, Luke is correct. It's hard to foresee these things. One may argue that Russia will not pull out of Abkhazia and South Ossetia until it becomes a full democracy. A critical issue with regard to how Russia might react has to do with European perceptions of the defensibility of Georgia. So in some respects, a key audience for our discussion today really needs to be the European allies. When the time comes that the European allies are ready to accept Georgia into NATO, America will not be behind. So a critical issue then is improving reforms in Georgia, democratic reforms, growing the economy faster, improving territorial defenses, and helping Europeans to understand that Georgia is fully ready. A second key issue, though, is defensibility. In the Baltic Sea, there is no limit on NATO warships, the number of NATO warships or how long they can stay. In the Black Sea, there's a severe limit on that. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought into sharper relief now, both in America but especially in Europe, is how difficult it is to defend the Baltic states. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion about that. My colleagues at RAND have done extensive wargaming and have concluded that Russian forces could be at the outskirts of the three Baltic capitals in 60 hours after an invasion. And that's a circumstance in the Baltic Sea where there are a lot of other allied and friendly countries and there's no limit on NATO warships. Black Sea is a very different circumstance. Georgia's in a different geography. So when we take a look at looking in the future, partly it's going to depend on perceptions of NATO's reaction, partly it's going to depend on perceptions of the defensibility of Georgia, and partly it's going to depend on perceptions of, is Georgia ready? Is it able to make the full financial contribution to the alliance? Has it strengthened its territorial defenses to raise the cost of aggression?
Still have a question.
My question is to Luke again. As promising and thought-provoking your proposal is for the years of Georgian NATO aspirants, there is still room for skepticism. Why would NATO do that? Why would NATO amend Article 6 for Georgia?
Well, they've done it in the past. I think it's in NATO's interest to consider this. I hope this debate can be carried to the European capitals as well. And because we can't be stuck in old ways of doing things. I mean, only dead fish go with the flow. We need to, keep moving forward, keep going, and find, new ways for the new times. And otherwise, we're going to be passed by events. So will NATO decide, I'm guessing, with all the praise that's been heaped on this today, which I'm very grateful and honored for, I doubt anyone across Europe has probably even read this report or knows it's out there. So I just hope that we can kind of spark a debate here that will spill over and, in the medium term have this discussion. I'm not proposing that at the Brussels, in my report I don't say that at the Brussels summit Georgia should be invited to join under these terms. I mean, there's going to be a lot of legwork behind the scene. In fact, I gave snuck in 3 recommendations for the Georgian government, which is something we normally don't do at Heritage, because we don't take government money. This report was not funded by the government of Georgia or the U.S. government. It was on my own initiative. But normally we put recommendations for a U.S. government, but I put 3 suggestions. I wouldn't call them recommendations, but suggestions for the Georgian government. And one of them is start approaching European capitals that are skeptical on this issue behind the scenes and informally now. Just fill them out, lay the groundwork for a discussion we can have in the future. So that's what I'm hoping that comes out of this. Thank you.
Did you want to say something? Yeah, I just very briefly just wanted to say that at this stage, it's very important that we avoid half measures. Again, I mean, it's not addressing in any ways your suggestion or strategy. By the way, I fully support idea of kind of expanding horizon and looking at this issue from multiple perspectives and looking at different options that we may have ahead of us. But the key is to going forward in our relationships, NATO-Georgian relationships. It's very essential to have not to repeat mistakes of Bucharest, in my view, because it was a half a measure. It didn't deliver on promise and didn't have a mechanism of delivering on promise, and that really triggered or however you qualify it, but it really didn't protect it. Let's put it this way: Georgia from Russian aggression. So whatever we do going forward is very essential that we keep the security of Georgia in mind, because country is facing this issue on a daily basis, so it's very essential that the steps that all of us agree with, meaning territorial defense and all that, should be very, very important priority at this stage.
Yes, I completely agree with this. As between joining NATO and strengthening territorial defenses is both more important for Georgia, and it's something that can be done now. Georgia needs not only Javelin anti-armor, it needs, as Luke pointed out, air defense capabilities, it needs coastal defenses. You recall the Russian Black Sea Fleet sailed over toward Georgia in the 2008 war. It needs a full range of command control, secure command control, communications, computing capabilities to mount an effective resistance. The most important thing is, again, to raise the cost of aggression, not necessarily to defeat a Russian invading force, but to raise the cost to the point that Russia will think twice about trying to invade Georgia.
That'll be our last question. Do you have any other final comments? I know you've all kind of had a chance here. Is there anybody else has one last?
I'll just say there are 20 recommendations in the paper, and we've only talked about one of them today. So have a read and look at the other proposals in there. Thanks.
Well, with that, I'll close the panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a rich and positive discussion today.
Thank you, sir.